Welcome to Mogobe Nuggets of Wisdom podcast. My name is Mompoloki Lerumo Mogobe. Our objective is to enthuse, inspire, energize, and empower entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of all stripes here in BW and beyond. We do so by inviting these entrepreneurs into our makeshift studio. Sometimes we call them to the restaurant, sometimes we go to our studio, and we ask them to share their experiential knowledge, their experiences and their expertise. And we ask them as many questions as we can, aimed at empowering you also as a viewer. Hello dear viewer, dear listener, my name is Mompoloki Lerumo Mogobe. Welcome to yet another exciting episode of Mogobe Nuggets of Wisdom. I have a very great and wonderful guest. He's an actor, he's a playwright, he's an author, I should say multiple author, and he's a son of the soil, and he doesn't spend a lot of time in the country, but I leave all that to him as he introduces himself. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Donald Molosi.
Thank you so much, sir.
Would you be kind enough to share a little bit about your background and get the viewers to know who you really are?
Yes. Thank you again for having me on the show. I am from Mahalape, so I grew up in Mahalape, did some of my schooling in Goveda, so grew up around the country. And then professionally, I became an actor later in life. And I became the first Motswana to perform on Broadway about more than 10 years ago now. And since then, I've gone into publishing my books and doing films.
I must say that I've actually watched one of your plays, the one where you talk about our first president and his life. What is the name of the play? I think I saw it at Mighty Song.
Blue, Black and White.
Okay, I think that's the one that is almost your signature play.
Yes, yeah. It's definitely the most popular one.
Okay.
And it's still being performed today, which I'm very happy about.
Okay. Is it also in the form of a book?
Yes. So in book form, it is actually in a collection with another play that I wrote called Motswana. And that book is called We Are All Blue.
Okay.
And so that's how I wanted to share the play sort of from the stage as well as literature.
Okay. Yeah. You've written 2 or 3 other books. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, there are 2 other books that are collections of short stories with other writers, so they are anthologies. And then when it comes to my own books, there's We Are All Blue and Dear Upright African.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm a little starstruck myself because I also saw you on the big screen in a Hollywood movie. Can you tell us about that experience?
It was an interesting experience. I was actually I had been living with the story of Ruth and Seresakama for more than a decade at that point. I was less than 30 years old, which means for more than a third of my life, I had been researching this story. So doing it on film with that cast was a continuation of the work that I had been doing all along. So it was exciting, but I was aware of what my work that came before had also done significantly.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, one of the books that you did is called Upright African. In fact, it serves as a basis for what we're going to talk about today. Can you just sort of introduce the book and tell us what was the motivation for writing it?
Yes, this is my new book that came out last year, and I'm very excited about it. It won the African Authors Awards last year for Best Narrative. And it came from my TED Talk, which I gave a TED Talk about being African and having gone to school in Africa and not knowing enough African history. And it resonated with a lot of people, and I thought I should put it into book form. And that's how the book came about. And I was happy that Kenyan author, the late Kenyan author, Binyavanga Wainaina, wrote the foreword, as well as Zimbabwean writer Titi Dangaremba also wrote the foreword, for them to say, we identify with this and we endorse this voice and the need to decolonize the African.
I can't wait to get my hands on it, but one of the chapters in that book, you actually go into the nitty-gritties of explaining how to be an upright African. Yes. And I'd like us to get into it, because one of the first things you say, teach confidence to build character. You say it's very important to teach confidence. And you do say that African children have been de-Africanized. Can you explain that?
Yes, I find that the school environment and the way that we do education does not allow for individuality. It's still very much a regime of wearing these uniforms and walking in straight lines. It's almost chilling when you think about it that way. But it doesn't allow for people to be individuals. And in a way, it becomes a place where the African child's dreams go to die. And so we need to teach confidence. There's no way all young Botswana people want to give one answer or have one answer. But when I do work with them, they struggle to find an answer that's not supposed to be the right one. And that's a lack of imagination. Yeah.
Because you can have multiple right answers. Correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And this idea that we are being made into become obedient children, can you
Yes.
explain the concept and explain how it manifests itself in adulthood?
I find that there are such wonderful things about our culture, Yasitswana, that there's Boto, that even includes politeness. I mean, it's in its smallest expression is politeness. And I also find that the colonial classroom loved to have Africans who are bowed and cowered and
Submissive.
and sort of, yes, sort of subdued. And I find that that continues to today, and in that we lose the opportunity to teach confidence.
And when you say that our brains have stopped functioning imaginatively, that is very, very sad. How do you mean this, and how does it manifest itself in real life?
I find that there's a sense in which thinking imaginatively has been punished for so long over time that it seems counterintuitive. There's a herd mentality. There's a lack of understanding of issues and even perceiving one's own reality. And it shows in how young people vote. They vote not based on issues. They vote based on a lack of imagination, which they were taught.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, let's now get to the second nugget, which is really the importance of teaching African texts in African classrooms. This one resonates with me because I didn't know until recently that we've had huge, colossal developments in Africa. And I was even reading somewhere that we have structures bigger than the Great Wall of China,
Yes,
which are
yes.
right here in Africa,
Yes.
the Great Zimbabwe. But these structures are never shown, they are never celebrated.
Yes.
Tell us more about this importance of teaching, texts, African texts in an African classroom.
I think when we teach African history that is written by Africans, we engage with world history that white supremacy would rather forget. And that's a wonderful thing. We then get to call Egypt Africa and call those pyramids African. And we get to know that those structures that are in Egypt are African. And these are some of the ways that changing the language around history gives power back to the people that it belongs to. Yeah.
And do you think that then there should be a prescribed African curriculum, or how is this going to happen in practical terms?
Yeah. There is a fantastic quote by Thomas Sankara, whom, of course, I borrow from in the title of my book, Upright African. He says that Africans are sort of bound by the same fate because we suffer the same miseries and the same joys. I think there is something to be said about a base curriculum that addresses Africa-wide issues that can be adopted locally as per country's needs on an individual basis. Yes.
All right, let's move on.
Yeah.
Given the African child options, teaching the truth about career opportunities to maximize the child's potential. That one might sound a bit like a mouthful, but can you unpack it for us and give specific examples if you don't mind?
Yes. I find that one of the tragedies of having such an outdated curriculum is that it glorifies the British Empire and its conquest of us. And we celebrate it more than the British people themselves. And one of the ways that manifests is that at a time when Britain was, ruling over 2/3 of the world, industrial revolution, there were certain professions that were glorified, because they had to benefit the British crown and, resuscitate the economy, such as being, like the things that are now esteemed: engineer, teacher,
accountant,
doctor. These very kind of a narrow selection of professions. And today we still teach the same thing that was glorified in the Industrial Revolution. Be a doctor, be a lawyer. And this is all the African child gets exposed to. And how sad when people today can be social media influencers, can be whatever they want to be, can be IT people who work with food. And to kind of teach these narrow things like, it's an outdated question. It should be the same way that today I'm an actor, writer, and director. And I can't pick one of those things because I live in 2020 where we are allowed to take up space like that.
So there's nothing wrong with being like me, a serial entrepreneur, because people
there's
say,
nothing
make
wrong.
up your mind.
There's nothing wrong.
One thing.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, it's good to meet someone who thinks the way I do. and how do you really get this across? How do you inculcate it in the youth? I mean, speak for instance to someone who might be watching, struggling with this point. How do I avoid being getting into that? Because the one argument I use, and this might help you answer my question, is to say, you know, as an entrepreneur, I look at Forbes 400 and I look for these professions that I'm supposed to get into.
Yes.
I'll rarely find somebody who's doing any of that in the Forbes 400, for instance. So that's an argument for saying you need a much broader outlook.
Yes.
But anyway, go ahead. That was my answer to my own question. Now I want you to put your own answer.
I'm in complete agreement sort of to broaden these labels. And just in any sense of taking any label with a sense of broadness is what we need to do. For example, if someone says they are an actor, I hope that when people think of actor or in the Botswana context, that I violate some of those stereotypes that they have, because I should be broader than that. I should have a voice that is not just about me being on stage, it's about me being on other stages. So we need to broaden all these categories and practice that way.
Suppose there's someone who's responsible for a curriculum, maybe for argument's sake, someone at the Ministry of Tertiary Education, Mote, and they may be watching this, and they're scratching their heads and say, look, that all sounds very sweet and wonderful, but how does it translate in practice? What does they do? What can they do? People feel kind of helpless and boxed in.
Yes. What they can do is that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can look at our history and recognize that in 1931, there was the Tati school that Katie Motsepe founded in Tati that taught Ikalanga and taught Ikalanga language and Ikalanga histories, and it was inclusive in that way. That if we just look at some of the examples we've had, in that one we learn inclusivity, and then we learn, okay, why are the Kalangas not part of history today in Botswana? Like, that's one lesson from one school. You will encounter another moment in Botswana history where we have done this before. And that is probably the sad thing, is that we are regressing. It's not that we are making new mistakes.
What about Van Rensburg and his education for production and all those brigades that he set up? Does that help us? Is there a blueprint we can pick from there? Absolutely.
That's another example, Rep. Patrick Van Rensburg, vocational training and using your hands to make a living as well as your mind. These are things that now we have lost sight of. Now it's all about a certificate, but can you boil an egg? Can you boil an egg and sell it to someone and convince them to pay for it? And so there are examples, like you're saying, Mogobe, in recent history to just go back to. So if I were the ministry, I would just flip to the last 50 years and consult that.
Maybe I should give you Minister Letsola Tebe's number, the Minister of Tertiary Education. You could perhaps maybe have a word with him.
I would love that.
Maybe you can learn something, one or two things there. All right. You say we must teach gender and sexuality. Are we not doing that?
We are not doing it in the right way. We are doing it in such a harmful way that it's almost better if we were not doing it at all. What we are teaching is Victorian morality. We are teaching sexism, and we are teaching, we are raising a nation of people who access their history only through the actions of men. How terrible. I mean, I look at just currency, 10 pula, 20 pula. Where are the women? Where are their faces? Whenever a woman is on currency in Botswana, she's looking down or she's domesticated.
I'm reminded of the one who's looking at that diamond.
Looking at the diamond, you don't see her face or agency. Or she's taking care of children. She's domesticated without her own agency. But the men have this presence. So that's just one example of saying, yes, we teach gender, but we don't teach gender parity or gender diversity.
You say something about the Buganda kingdom. How are they handling it? Or how does it tie in?
It ties in because Uganda has a rich history that is documented of sexual and gender diversity, even within their royalty. They've had kings who take on men and women as lovers. And yet now we see that Uganda is one of the most regressive African countries when it comes to those rights. So that is the lamentation that I say can be fixed over time through decolonizing the curriculum.
Now, this one, for someone like me, I didn't quite understand what you mean. You're saying we must demystify the idea of two genders, one sexuality. What do you mean two genders, one sexuality? I didn't understand that one.
Yes, so when we learn in school today, the genders, we know that we learn that there's two genders. There's two genders, yes, male and female.
Yes.
Right? Men and women. And then we also learn that there are only 2 or 3 sexualities. So probably heterosexual, homosexual, and maybe people will acknowledge bisexual. But the tragedy of this is that there aren't just men and women who are, not all men are born male, and not all women are born female. So we have to make room for people who may have become male over time in their lives or become female over time, or women or men, however they identify. I find that when I looked at the moral education syllabus, it was so bent on teaching Christian morality that it demonized anyone who wasn't heterosexual. And I thought, that's a shame to be teaching to children today. When I, at 34, I'm not even that regressive, and yet I'm teaching it to my child. That's a tragedy of the curriculum.
Yeah, that one is a bit complex because I feel we are a Judeo-Christian community, and there are certain things that are supposed to be biblical. So I think that one you'll have to work very hard to convince
but
the
I find,
community.
Remuko, that we are Judeo-Christian when it's convenient. When it's convenient, we say we're secular. When the outside world, international world is watching, we say we're secular.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Now, in terms of your travels as an actor and a playwright, is there an ideal society or an ideal blueprint or some community that you've come across which has it right in terms of what you're talking about?
Yes, I think a lot of Asian countries I have visited really put their cultures at the center of learning. They put their languages as the vehicles of learning. And I was in Taiwan as part of the celebrations of their centenary. And one of the things I noted was how you are tested on local Taiwanese knowledge first before you're tested on what's considered international knowledge. Whereas here, one could be completely clueless about Botswana and get a shining Cambridge certificate and do well in the local economy, which I don't think is sustainable over time.
All right, I think moving right along, Mr. Molosi, and I'm so starstruck. I mean,
I'm starstruck. You're my mentor.
Yes, it's such a privilege to be in your presence, honestly. And if I can mentor you back, that's great.
Thank you, sir.
But anyway, the idea of mobilizing schools to play an active role in their own decolonization. We want to be decolonized because, we want to be free mentally.
Yes.
So how can schools play a role? How can headmasters and headmistresses there play a role in their own decolonization, as well as the students?
Yes, the big goal I think the schools could get at, that we should try to get them to, is to have African history that's told by Africans taught to the students. That can take different forms. And the National Archives in Botswana recently ran a Facebook post about how Livingston and all these, I'm sure, wonderful white men discovered Lake Ngami. And I thought, how insulting. And if the National Archives thinks we were discovered, then this is going to be in a textbook. Then, you know, that's where the community comes in to hold schools accountable and to hold sources that schools draw from, like the archives, accountable. And I find it sad that, you know, even today, we are still using the colonial words for our streets. What's Francistown? I mean, all of this, and when you look at who Francis was, and the pillaging, and the violence, the plundering, and should it be really the name that we exalt? So as we put pressure on schools, I hope we put the same pressure on the community to decolonize.
Just do the little work of explaining why it's wrong to say, you know, the Victoria Falls or Lake Victoria was discovered by Livingston. Yeah. Explain in simple terms why it is just wrong and it amounts to a form of mental colonization to think like that.
Yes, it is the highest form of erasure. We're literally displaced from history. It's almost as though our forebears did not see Lake Ngami, did not, you know, create all the knowledge around it. It's as though they don't exist in history. So I think it's erasure of the highest order, and it's a violence we do to Black people in history, and it needs to stop because we are literally dying out.
So how do we go about it? I mean, I know that the Victoria Falls is called Musiwa Tunya. We've always had Musiwa Tunya.
Yeah.
And why is it such a wonderful thing that someone came and saw it and then discovered it? I don't understand how that came about, because one thing is that for you to undo a certain mindset, you have to know how it got there to reverse it.
Yes. I think it was the idea that, the racist idea that Black people are not fully human. So despite them having had civilizations around, say, Victoria Falls, and having perceived it and seen it, it's not seen until it's seen by a white man. And how disappointing, how sad, and how, you know, desperate of change. And this is the decolonization we want to see in our schools, so that future presidents, future leaders don't speak to us in a colonial language and don't parade horses in a colonial fashion, and actually take on our own rituals and our own ways of doing things without having to replicate colonial pageantry of power.
To his credit, our first president, whom you've played many times on stage, has famously said that a nation without
the past is a lost nation.
I knew you would complete that. Yeah. So how can you build on that in the context of you saying, one of the points you've raised is that parents must play an active role in changing the mindset of their children?
Yes. I think there's a thing that is going on in Botswana and a lot of the colonized, you know, still colonized world, in that neo-colonized world, in that having a child who doesn't speak your local language is a status symbol. Having a child who speaks English very well is a status symbol. These are some of the ways in which we, personally in our homes, continue the empire, the British Empire. It does not live in terms of territory anymore. It lives metaphysically. And we are continuing the metaphysical empire. And for as long as I'm willing to pay through my nose for the Africanness to be beaten out of my child through the curriculum, I'm continuing that. It's not right or wrong. It is something we need to be aware of.
I think you're not advocating for total stoppage of the use of English.
No.
For instance, I mean, there's no irony. There's a bit of irony in the fact that we're communicating in English. But I'm saying, putting it across and getting these children to understand. I fought with my children endlessly to the point where I felt that it was now making me sick. I stopped fighting. Where I said, no, to someone at the village, you're not going to be speaking in English. They have difficulty adjusting.
And you see, Mogobe, it's almost as if, I mean, colonialism was a horrible thing. There's no gift in it. But if there's any sort of silver lining, it's that we are able to take from different cultures. I can just be in different spaces. It's the product of colonialism. To then say to a child who has all this choice, Hore, I want you to be as British as possible, is to minimize the potential of the child. And a 20-year-old today can hold all these cultures in their heads very easily. Yeah.
Now, you've lived overseas for how long now?
I'm 34. I came to Botswana. So for 15 years, and then I came to Botswana at 30 years old.
Okay.
Yes.
So you've seen the importance of raising your flag.
Yes.
And has it worked for you? Because people think that somehow they have to assimilate when they get to other cultures.
Yes, I'm not one of those people.
Yes. Yeah.
I think for me, the whole process of self-decolonization means that I'm going to be all that I am at all times, if I can. So if there's a way I speak, it will have all these influences, it won't be prescribed. And I have found that naturally when we go into other people's cultures, we find our way without having to become them. And they respect you more when you have what's your own.
Because I was saying that one to get to my next point, which is calling on all alumni. What are your thoughts there? What the point you want to make with that one?
I think there are enough of us who have gone through this system. Everything that I say, the beatings, all this unnecessary, the sexual relations with teachers, these are things that every Motswana knows and has witnessed, if not experienced. You are alumni of the same system, whether you've gone through the education system or not, or you were a parent. So call out the same system and ask why certain things are done a certain way and why Setswana is not included, even though you're paying so much for a private school, etc. So those are the alumni I'm calling on to say, you know, they are experiencing, especially the young people, they're experiencing the worst brunt of unemployment that was created on purpose with an outdated curriculum. I want their anger to be very visible towards the curriculum that is creating unemployment on purpose by teaching old things that are not relevant today.
When you say on purpose, maybe the government or the cabinet of this country might quiver with that, might query that and say, it's not on purpose. It's not in our interest to have people in the streets. So why do you insist it is on purpose?
I think all African governments that I call out in this book would take offense, but it's what they do when they insist on a curriculum that my mother was taught in the 70s. When they insist on a curriculum centered around Eurocentricity, they are making me unable to enter the workforce in a meaningful way in my local environment. When I take on an internship with Mogobe, for example, and I've just graduated from UB, a lot of the time, if Mogobe says, can you read this memo? I won't be able to make sense of it. And that's my unemployability, which is created on purpose by them choosing to focus on things less important. I think it's a choice they're making.
Mr. Molosi, there's a story I came across in the book about how you got the name Donald. It involves your great-grandfather, etc. Can you share it with the viewer?
Yes, it's so my Setswana name is Lerumo, and then my English name is Donald. That already speaks to the craziness of colonialism, right? The legacy of it. There are many. My father liked Don Williams, so there's a story about that. Maybe Donald is from there. But then there's a more interesting story that my aunt told me. That on my maternal grandmother's side, they are descendants of a Scottish man who had come to Botswana. And so there had been kind of some of these names within the family and some of these pigments within the family. I don't have it, but they're very light people in my family. And I thought it sort of symbolizes the way that we carry the colonizer in us and ourselves in us. And we have to be kind to ourselves in that, instead of thinking, oh, we should do away with English and only speak Setswana, right? We should say, well, English happened upon me by history's violence. I claim it as mine. So take it as yours. So the same way I use the name Donald, I claim it just as I use Lerumo and I claim that. And I think it's very important when we decolonize ourselves.
I like that. I want to just go back, double click there.
Yeah.
English happened upon me as a result of the violence of history.
Violence.
I like
so
that.
let me make a gift out of it and speak it when I want, alongside many other things that are as intelligent.
Yes.
Yeah.
In other words, take advantage of it. And what about those who may argue that in the context of Botswana, it did help because we went to the Queen to ask for a protection, and otherwise would have been overrun by the Boers. Some say, look, that's a good reason for having had the British.
I wouldn't ever agree that there was a sort of a good thing about colonialism. But also just about the story you referenced in Mogobe, the three Dikosi going to London. It's one of the most misunderstood stories in our history that I think we need to decolonize and correct it in textbooks. Our Dikosi did not go there to ask for protection. We had already been a protectorate for 10 years. They were going there to ask to not be put under Rhodes. So we had already been a protectorate. And this is one of the stories that I feel that when we...
In other words, not to be absorbed into Rhodesia.
Yes, yes. And when we decolonize the classroom and include these stories at length, not just like kind of 3 pages with a caption, we get to learn that they were visionary leaders who made a political move. And they were not beggars who were going there to beg sort of at a level below dignity. And this is where history fails us.
So how did the protection come about then? What is the true story of that?
The protectorate was declared in 1885 on British Bechuanaland and also on...
we never asked for it. Was it
on
imposed?
The Bechuanaland Protectorate.
Was it asked? Was it imposed? Or how did it happen?
It was imposed because colonialism has been that violent. And I think that when we look at history that is African through African eyes, we really see colonialism as being violent. Otherwise, we will continue teaching things about being discovered and being given Christianity, which all seem too benign for something that covers up genocides.
It's very interesting. Now, you say it's important for us to connect with the diaspora. By that, you're referring to people, you know, in New York and far-flung places. I believe there are some Africans even in China. So what is the importance of doing that?
I think that one of the things that were stripped from the African were the connections to other African people, to people of African descent throughout the world. When a Chinese child travels the world today, they are part of a big Chinese network that operates only in Chinese throughout the world, throughout whatever city. What happens when a Motswana child travels? They are constantly bending themselves into London, Englishness, bending themselves into Paris, Frenchness, etc. That must stop. It's not normal. And I think that it's through decolonizing these ideas of who we should be that we realize connecting to African Americans and to Caribbean people of African descent is actually a way of...
Brazil.
Yes, and in Brazil, all over the world, there's a way of dismantling the same structure that oppresses all of us.
And in fact, you'll be freer to move if you are mentally emancipated. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yes.
You are freer to move and see the world.
Yes.
Because, all right, that's very interesting. So how's the diaspora, in their case, responding to your outreach? Are they welcoming?
Very welcoming. I'm very encouraged. I think that being on the African continent the past 4 years has shown me why it's easy for me to focus on certain issues when I'm outside. When I'm here, it's all about staying alive and day to day. And the diasporans that I've launched the book with have been welcoming. In Berlin last year, I launched the book to coincide with the 130th of the demarcation of Africa. So I launched the book, went to the same building.
The Berlin Conference.
The Berlin Conference, 1884 to, from 1884.
Yeah.
I went to Bismarck's house where Africa was cut up like a cake, staged a protest there with fellow writers, African writers, and launched my book saying, you people who sat in this room and divided that land and dished out so much violence, a new generation has come.
The worst case being what happened in the middle there with Leopold and Zaire.
Exactly.
You can cry if you hear what used to happen there.
Yes.
Because it was his, Leopold's personal fiefdom, isn't it?
Yes.
And all right, so as an entrepreneur, I'm obviously curious about how Botswana entrepreneurs, creatives, or people who are, developing themselves overseas, how they are received. How has the diaspora received you internationally?
The diaspora has been very receptive. I think a lot of my work bridges their relationship with the continent. And so they find in that sort of their own experiences and also experiences they wish they could have. Locally, I've been in Botswana, I've been able to work with Nako Timepieces. It's a Timepieces brand. They currently have the 3 Kosi edition out now.
Yes.
And we are partnering in 2020 to commemorate 125 years since the 3 Kosi made that trip to Bristol. So as part of...
London or Bristol?
Bristol, and then ended up in London.
Yes.
But the port was Bristol.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes. So that's sort of purely, it's business, but it's also about continuing both our brands and their work in that. Yes.
That's exciting.
Yes.
All right. Importance of legislation. Our parliament is on right now. The National Assembly is sitting. Social distancing, as is the norm.
Yes.
You say it's important to legislate. If one of the MPs happen to be watching this video, how would you propose they go about this?
If one of the MPs were watching, I would say to them that we want Botswana to look as good in real life as it does on paper. And by that, we are saying legislate looking at maximizing the potential of the children. You don't have to go far to know what to do. You have already ratified a lot of treaties. You signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the 90s. You signed the African Charter on the Rights and Responsibilities of the Child in the late 90s. So you already know what to do. Just go back to what you promised to do and implement it. And on the issue of legislation, I will also say to go further, to legislate against the minimization of the child's potential in the classroom. By that I mean that issues of defilement in the classroom should be taken very seriously and almost have a special set of laws for that, because it's about a child's potential in a learning environment. That's where they fail to legislate. And that's where they fail to set up commissions on the violence that happens in classrooms. And that's why I feel comfortable saying they, on purpose, maintain this colonial environment in the classroom and the colonial curriculum, and on purpose keep the African child minimally able to contribute in a meaningful way.
So they should try and emancipate the African mind.
Yes.
Through legislation. The
Yes.
challenge is maybe encourage them as to how it can be done.
Yes.
That would be the challenge. How can it be done?
Yes.
Mobilizing,
Yes.
agitating, and even through activism.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think that even when we know that the law takes its own processes, goes through Parliament, there's behavior that they can embody. And this is where I call to them directly, all our leaders. Embody a behavior that's anticipating a certain change. If you are still saying we're working on the laws about defilement, behave like people who care about defilement. And in this, I would say, if you want to connect with the millennials, optics matter. If someone is charged with a certain charge, don't make them be visible in certain ways in proximity to children. These things matter. Otherwise, when you do legislate eventually, it'll seem like you're just playing a political game.
Lip service.
Right.
Okay. All right. What projects are you working on now? I heard you say that you're going overseas soon. What projects exciting projects can we expect from Mr. Donald Molosi?
I am working on a few projects, one of which is I'm moving to the UK for a year. I had lived there for drama school, so I'm returning to the UK to research the archives of Botswana that are not in Botswana, were stolen and kept in London. I want to access them. I want to look at them and say, what is not at home that is about home? And see what kind of story comes out of that. And see how...
I didn't even know they're taking our archives away.
Yes, they are locked up in the British archives, and that's what I'll be accessing to say, what was Botswana called before? What was this? How did we dress? How did we do things? And in that way, to learn that which me in my black man self was not supposed to learn about myself. So that will be my next project. It will be in my films and in my books, whatever stories I find that my forefathers had no way of passing to me.
One of my mysteries for me is the real distinction between British Bechuana land and Bechuana land, and why for the longest time we had a capital in Mafikeng, and then upon independence everything was relocated.
Yes.
Why couldn't British Bechuana land continue to be part of Bechuana land? Maybe you can solve that mystery.
Yes.
Or you already know the answer.
Well, I'll be looking into the story of the 3D Kosi. I think I will be able to come back to you in a few months, because they have a lot to do with that.
Okay, yes. Wonderful. Now, as we part, Momolussi, I'd like you to look at the camera and share with the viewer something inspirational, something motivational, a takeaway, so that maybe when you reconnect in future, you might be able to say, I remember that comment, that statement. Yes.
I'm talking to this camera. I want to say to every Motswana who's watching me to start believing that we matter and we matter equally. For every opportunity you imagine for yourself or your child, it should be the same opportunity that you think some people have as just the preserve of their being born. So you matter equally. And I want that to show in how we approach the boardroom, how we approach the audition room, and how we negotiate deals. And yes, that's all I'll say. That remember, you matter and you matter equally.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
How do we get in touch with you? How do we contact you? How are you accessible on social media and elsewhere?
Yes, I'm across all social media at Donald Molosi is my
handle.
My handle.
Yeah.
And I'm on Facebook again as Donald Molosi.
Okay.
I have a Wikipedia page, so there's a lot of stuff that's out there that people can find out, and even how to reach me.
Okay.
Very easy to reach.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to encourage them to watch Mogobe Nuggets of Wisdom?
I encourage them to watch Mogobe. I encourage you to watch Mogobe Nuggets of Wisdom, because this is where we get to have conversations that are intergenerational with our elders. And my mentor, Mogobe, it's been a wonderful time sharing with him.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. It was a privilege and an honor.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.